As many of you will know following this channel, I am reflecting deeply on Quakers and how we are in the world and what we can contribute to the world, and especially in some challenging times that we face in the world today. I think there is a role that Quakers can play in a very positive sense. But what I want to show you today is some of the things that people are commenting on us, which you may not be aware of, and really how we are being situated as some quite key players, really, in the thinking and the way in which these ideas are developing. So I have called this presentation Are Quakers Choosing Woke Over God? Now, I know that's a very challenging title. Um, I do want to show you that the answer perhaps is not as bleak as you might fear. And I think I want to show that it's perhaps on the surface it does look like we have done that for various reasons, but that we do have something to offer, and there's perhaps a way in which we can think about what Quakers are, what we believe, what our witness is, that I hope is helpful. So what I want to start with then is showing you a bit about the podcasters that are talking about Quakers today. So this is in September 2025, and I want to show you the podcast Triggernometry, where Tom Holland is talking about the impact and the role of Quakers as the kinds of activism of what might be called woke ideas. So let's put this into context. This is in early September. This has been recorded with Tom on their podcast. So, in the context of that, September 2025, this is before the killing of Charlie Kirk, which happened a couple of weeks later, which is another seismic shift, which I think I can reflect on here today. But at this point, they're not mentioning that. They're talking about woke ideas and thinking about what has been happening over the last 10, 15 years around Black Lives Matters protests, for example. Now, what Tom says in all of his interviews recently and his books is that the importance of Christianity as a foundational framework to understand how Westerners are and how Britons are is crucial. And what he actually says is that because we don't realize this, we don't realize that the way in which we critique Christianity is in itself a Christian outlook. So he talks about how kind of, barbaric other ways of living are in times gone past, compares different cultures from throughout the ages, and looks at what we've got here in Britain as a specific Christian infused culture and a way of looking at right and wrong. So, what he says is that the way in which we are Christian, because we've now become detached a little bit from Christianity as a society, we curiously we judge Christianity as part of the problem. And he says, well, this is quite a strange thing because we're judging it through a Christian outlook, which we don't realize. Like fish doesn't know it's in water. We don't realize how Christian we're being. Now, when they start talking about the protests of around 2020 and the BLM movement, Black Lives Matter, he says this is a deeply Christian movement and something that Quakers in 18th century would have recognized. And the line of descent from the activism of Quakers is very clear. Now, I think this is really interesting. He talks about, for example, the toppling of the statue in Colston statue in Bristol. And he talks about all of these kinds of movements as being quite Christian in their form. But then he goes on to make a very specific point about Quakers and as well as the rest of the protesters, which is that because this line of activism has jettisoned the Christian scripture, the Christian practice, and the Christian self-identification, that had provided structure for the Quakers and the early activists. They essentially have to construct their own traditions. So what he actually says is that he sounds a little bit of a warning note here. He says because this kind of activism is unmoored from Christianity, the way in which they're developing is unclear. And he's a historian, of course, he's looking backwards. But he does argue that he feels that they are mutating. He says when you unmoor ideas and stories and traditions from the context and from that gave them birth, they can mutate very quickly. And this is fascinating. Now, I've always talked about Tom Holland's work because he's been saying these kinds of things for a good couple of years. What's interesting to me here, and I think is significant, is usually when he talks about this type of dissent and activism, he talks about other types of dissenters of the 18th century. He talks about, the levelers and the renters and the seekers. And in this occasion, he actually only mentions Quakers. Now, is this relevant? I don't know. Is this specific, a specific kind of point he's trying to make? I don't know. Well, the next slide is going to show you how that conversation between Tom Holland and the podcasters develops. Fascinating. So, the podcasters, if you're not watching Triggernometry, it's a very, very influential podcast. Konstantin Kissin on the right there and Francis Foster, comedians originally, have begun this hugely popular podcast, trying to understand the world today, and they have a huge number of different people speaking. Now, they tell a story on this video about a recent interviewee on their show who showed them this information and said that where Quakers settled in the States in 1875, so where you can see all those red dots there, where there were Quaker meetings in 1875, he argues maps onto where he has identified woke ideas. Now, I think if you look at what he's called this map, it's political violence, demonstrations, and strategic developments in the US around 2020. So that's over a period of from May to August in 2020. So you can see there in the northeast of the States, essentially. Now, I don't know what to make of this. I'm not so interested in is this true or is this a fair point. What I'm really surprised by is the way in which Triggernometry and Tom Holland are discussing Quakers as part of where these ideas have come from and how they've been shared and, developed. And of course, right now I'm recording this after the death of Charlie Kirk, and we have seen that the American government are really talking about this now. What does this mean? Where have these ideas come from? And have these woke ideas caused some of this violence to outbreak? So there's a real importance and energy here as to why this conversation is happening and what is it that's leading people like these podcasters to query where are these ideas coming from because they want to understand them. So I think remarkably, we're in a position where quite a lot of people want to try to understand Quaker ideas. Not always for reasons that are sympathetic to us, um, which I think is really interesting. Now, let's think a little bit about what we mean by these woke ideas, and if I can just I've put some definitions there from various places. So, for example, this idea that it comes from racial um, issues originally, but then it's expanded quite quickly. So, woke is this idea of being very, very alert to social injustice. And Quakers would agree with this. I mean, the vast majority of Quakers would say, yes, we are. alert to social injustice, particularly related to racism, but also now gender inequality, LGBTQ rights. Um, and I think, to some extent, Quakers are just going to say, well, yes, we are. What's the problem? But then, of course, it's become a bit more than that. And I suppose one of the things that we're looking at here is how woke has shifted in its meaning. So YouGov did a survey in the last year or two, and it gave people the right to the opportunity to make their own definition of woke. And apparently 10% of people created a definition of people who are overly sensitive and offended by everything. And another definition there is woke is a practice which is requested or even enforced as a way of thinking. So there's some element of authoritarianism, which is what the critics are picking up on. It's not just a being alert to social injustice, but it's saying you must now do this, you must now act like this because we have identified this social injustice. And trigonometry themselves, so um, I remember Constantine basically saying things like, well, he defines woke as being detached from reality, so something that's not so much based in reality, more kind of the postmodernist thinking, if you like, concerned with trivial issues. Um, so there's various things there that he talks about. We're not looking at bigger issues, is concerned with trivial issues, and have a hierarchy of victimhood. Very much a case of saying, that we're overly simplistic in looking at who is suffering these injustices. And of course, he's of an immigrant background himself, so he's very aware of that and quite critical of how um, race is playing into these issues of injustice. Now, when we try to think about, well, what would Quakers, what's a fair observation, if you like, of how Quakers do woke ideas? I mean, I think it's a fair point, and I think it's a fair criticism. We are very, very alert to social injustice. The question is, do we sometimes take it too far? Well, there are some potentially fair points that they're making concerned with trivial issues. One of the things I was thinking about was the removal of William Penn's name, for example, from some of the rooms at Friend's house because of his links with slavery, and really oversimplifying that issue. Um, so I think there is a fair point and a fair criticism, and it's worth, I always think, listening to what our critics are saying, because I think these concerns are being voiced in a very reasonable way, and it's worth listening to the full interview there, which I would encourage you to do. So I think the first thing that I want to do is to pose some questions and to think, well, are we unmoored, or are we getting more and more unmoored from Christianity? I think it's a fair point, again, to say we have been. I think many people are saying that. And as we know in Quakers, some area meetings are voicing concerns around that. And if we accept that we have done that, there's more non-theists, for example, amongst us, not everybody is Christian. If we have become a little bit more unmoored, does it mean we have been mutating? Now, I think my answer, if you've been watching a lot of my videos and interviews with people and discussions, not everyone's worried about it, but I think generally people do agree that we're changing. So I think that's worth thinking about a little bit more and keeping under reflection. One of the specific things I would like to raise is how our yearly meeting agendas are being structured and put together. Now, I know a lot of people put a lot of work into that, but I want to kind of raise these questions about how much, if we were based in Christianity, good and proper, we would be spending a huge amount of time in worship together and really carefully and prayerfully discerning the way forward. And I'm not alone, I think, in thinking that there's perhaps a lot of activist ideas. there's perhaps some particular secular movements that are having an impact on our agendas and therefore the decisions that come out of it. And I'm going to argue that there are some historical habits that we've developed. So I do think it's worth thinking about that and challenging that. And if you followed some of the interviews, I've spoken about this already with people. Maybe we need to take more time within our yearly meeting agendas, I spoke about that with Matt Rosen and with Alison Mitchell, and just thinking about how do we slow down our decision making and really root our our thinking and our taking actions and taking decisions, root it far more in worship. So I think that's important. And of course, as you will know, I do think that the third question here is, are we truly grounding our social activism in today's reality? We're in a very quick changing world. I mean, it's astonishing what's happening. Or do we have much more impact, much more influence on us through secular ideologies than perhaps deep, deep worship together and certainly Christian language, religious ideas, and prayer. And I think it's a fair criticism. And I would rather us be self-reflective and really take a good look at what we're doing and listen to different voices, um, than just taking what our critics are saying to us. And I think there is a lot of talk about listening to different voices, and that just it always seems to mean the same thing. There's people centrally saying things. Well, we must listen to young people more. I think, well, we already do listen to young people a lot. So so I think we have to try to keep a balance here. I know, and I think I am finding people to speak with a variety of viewpoints. I mean, I did a bit of a joke short the other day that we're not all vegan. We don't all have blue hair and we don't all live in London. There's a kind of I mean, the reason why that joke is funny and people have commented on it is because there's a hint of truth there that we're over emphasizing these voices. We're not listening perhaps to people out in the rest of the country who are not vegan, who are a bit more maybe centrist in their viewpoints. And and I also think as well that we're perhaps very heavily influenced by some of the things around veganism, around climate catastrophe, etc. So I think it's worth reflecting on those carefully as a community. And the reason I suppose I am asking us to think about these things is we're in such a turbulent time of change that I do think that Quakers can provide the world with some leadership. I mean, in a small way, but we've just seen here that some of these podcasters are challenging us and I think saying in a fairly negative way that the ideas that Quakers had in the 18th century have brought about this way of thinking, which is a huge influence, isn't it? Well, if that's the case, I think we can be influential again. And I think it's fair to say that what we had to say in the 18th and 19th centuries was very important, and even into the 20th century. It's very important. There was a huge amount of horror going on as part of the Christian world. So to have these kinds of correctives around how we deal with issues of race and gender and equality of the sexes and equality of the races, etc., and the abolition of slavery, it was clearly an important thing that we offered then. But the world has changed, and undoubtedly, we don't have the same issues in the Western world that we did 300 years ago. The world is different. So as we reflect following the death of Charlie Kirk, which I think is a seismic event, it may have come as a surprise to some people. I mean, well, obviously the death came as a surprise to and a terrible tragedy, a terrible shock. I mean, it's hard to express that really. Um, but I certainly wasn't one of the people who said, "Well, who's Charlie Kirk?" I knew exactly who he was and what he was doing, and the tragedy of it. And I think the reason why Quakers have to really engage with these ideas is that he was a man who was advocating what we think we advocate in the sense of conversation, peacemaking, building bridges, bringing people together who don't agree, and yet holding a space in which we can talk. And he did that in a wonderful way. Now, not everyone liked it, I get that, and people's feelings were hurt, and they didn't agree with what he was saying. But conversation is the way forward. And he talked about, when conversations stop, that's when violence happens. And it's absolutely tragic that he was killed. And I think what it then puts into a spotlight, and if you're not watching these developments unfold, you might not realize just the spotlight that is happening on all of these ideas, which, well, millions of people across the world are now interrogating. Where have these ideas come from and how have they developed? How have we got to this situation where a young person has felt that real violence of the bullet kind is in any way a defensible or justifiable response to conversations and discussions and conservative Christian viewpoints, which even if we don't share, we must uphold their right to be Christian. Um, so we have something to say here, and what I want to then offer, this second half of the presentation came as a bit of a surprise to me, if I'm honest. I'd thought this was the end of my presentation, and a whole new way of thinking about this came to me over the course of this week, and I managed to put it together. So let's see what you think about this. Um, I am going to make the point that we have drifted. This idea of have we mutated? I'm going to make the analysis that our testimonies, as we call them, have actually shifted. Now, obviously, those of you who are Quakers will know what I'm talking about. In Britain, we talk about the PEST as the acronym, so peace, equality, simplicity, and truth. And I'm going to offer a new, framework here. But first of all, I want to think about, well, what are our testimonies now? And are they still a reasonable description of what the fruits of our spirits in Quakers are? So the fruit of our spirit in Christian terminology is what is our witness? What do we do in practice? And building on Rachel Muir's book here, Testimony, where she talks about what is testimony, shared community defining traditions of practice. So what I want to show you is two slides. First of all, I'm going to argue that even though we say we have four testimonies currently in the UK, and I know across the world other Quakers have um, listed these in slightly different ways, but broadly they're these things. And I want to suggest that in practice, I think we've moved away from these. And this is perhaps why we have some internal tensions where we can't quite understand why we disagree, and yet we're both Quaker. And I think I can offer something here that might help. So let me show you this then. So our four testimonies and why I think they have mutated. First of all, my critique, as is no surprise to you, I am not convinced that we are actually focusing on peace very much. I think what we're actually doing when we, for example, create minutes around calling what's happening in Gaza, as terrible as it is, when we go so far as making a minute around it being genocide, when we spend such a lot of time in activism at protests and with placards and with marches and with getting involved in counter protests. We're certainly, I think, more like anti-war and a protest movement than we are a peace church. And I think now this is very challenging, and I hope you'll feel a little bit better when I tell you what I think is our real concern here. But one of the things that concerns me is the way in which we think we're talking about peace and peacemaking, but we're not. Now, the reason why I think having peace as a testimony with one word is oversimple for a start. But we have never been really completely pacifist. But this is the impression it gives us. It gives the impression that Quakers are routinely and uniformly pacifist, and we never have been since the last 300 years that we've been around. Whenever there has been wars, some Quakers have gone to war. And of course, there's a bigger focus on conscientious objection, but actually, there's always been some contesting of that. So I don't think it's particularly truthful way to look at how we approach peace as a church. The second thing is equality. Now, again, I think it's more accurate to say that we have become very egalitarian. I think this is a very fair description of what we do and what we are. We're very much influenced by feminism. We believe in the equality of the sexes, to the extent even that we think there are no differences really between men and women. And I think we're very much in that way of thinking broadly. Um, you know, non-binary and an androgyny, if you like, is very much, I think, comes from Quakers. Now, whether that's um, across the whole of Quakers, I don't know, but certainly in Britain, we're very, very much um, generally supportive of that. And of course, is non-hierarchical, and it's quite a big thing to us that we're not doffing our hats to the rich, which is what the issue was back in 300 years ago. But having some kind of non-hierarchy, a flat structure, which means that we don't have clergy, etc. So I wanted to rethink that really, because in terms of how we are as a practice, a community of practice, and as a tradition, um, I think we can be more precise actually in how we are acting out this testimony to equality in the current era. And of course, you could put in there really that we're actually incredibly permissive. We're incredibly very, very quite extreme actually in our position on things like LGBTQ inclusion. So we take a very specific approach, and that is where I do think we have mutated and we have continued to shift. 2009, when we made the same-sex marriage decision in Britain, was just one switch from that. So that's quite a long time ago now, and we've continued to mutate, not to everybody's happiness. And I suppose the point that I continually make is that means that some people have drifted away. And I do think many people choose not to come and be part of our church anymore because we have taken such a strong and quite extreme viewpoint on this. Now, when it comes to simplicity, I was almost at a loss as how to even claim that simplicity is any part of what we do anymore. Um, there's nothing simple about how we act and how we work together. We have a simple worship method in the sense that we have simple buildings and no singing and no sermon or whatever. And so that's, I suppose, fairly simple. But actually, when we reflect on how we are as a community, we know we have bureaucratic processes and a structure that is built up to an elaborate structure, so at the point that we're trying to simplify now. So to say that we still have a testimony to simplicity is not quite accurate in Britain 2025. Now, what I think we do have is, again, some specific, very specific ways in which that has developed. And I think a mutation is a fair description of that. So I would describe it as frugalism. We are actually quite a frugal group of people, and we value frugalism. We try not to waste. We try not to be excessive in the kinds of things that we buy, for example. We're like allotments and growing vegetables and all of that business, and reusing and recycling and then some other ways in which this simplicity message has become something more specific is in the climate catastrophe. That is the language that a lot of Quakers like to use, and they're very prominent within our movement, very prominent voices in the church. So people who are taking a slightly more reserved approach to climate change, thinking, well, we need to respond more slowly, they're not really prominently heard. We're very much on the kind of the green movement and Greta Thunberg and type voices. And then the other thing is veganism. I mean, it's become a huge movement within Quakers. Many people are, vegetarian already and have been since the 60s, but actually a new move to veganism and oat milk and whatever else. Now, I would say there's nothing about that that's simple either. Um, it is it's what we talk about when we think, oh, well, this is a simple and ethical way to live. But I've got some queries about that, and I think veganism as an approach actually is not some kind of, rose-tinted way to live as an old-fashioned way. Well, it's not actually. It requires a huge corporate structure, industrial infrastructure to be able to feed people in a vegan way. That's what I would argue anyway. And then truth. Now, again, originally 300 years ago, when these testimonies came about, we were called, children of the light and friends of the truth, capital T, God's truth, one singular reality. Now, I think the way in which we speak in Quakers and culturally, we have moved away from that. And I think there is a danger in that, but I think it's more honest for us to say, well, we believe in honesty. We believe in trying to, go about your business in an honest way. Absolutely. But we very much consider that individual viewpoint matters. And if you have a different opinion on the truth, we quite kind of welcome that and say, oh, well, that's your truth. Now, again, I would challenge some of that and say, well, you have a perspective on the truth. It's not quite the same thing. There's something also about ideological conformity. And one of the things I keep raising as an area of concern for me is that we are being pushed into an ideological conformity, which is part of the wider secular and political culture we find ourselves in, especially on the left. Many Quakers, certainly in Britain, are broadly on the left. And I'm seeing a worrying kind of ideological conformity being pushed, and we're seeing that within Quakers as well. Now, some of the things that I haven't told you about in terms of what our critics say is that somehow we've been infiltrated and people are pretending to be Quakers, and bringing in these secular ideas and changing our membership, actually. I don't know how much to, that's is quite a big claim, but a lot of people are talking about that online. So let me show you then what it is that I have come up with instead. And it's fascinating to me how this came about. Um, it came to me over the course of one evening. I mean, I have been praying a lot about all of these issues. And again, in the week following Charlie Kirk's death and the way in which these ideas have been interrogated by our critics online, I've really started to pray deeply about what is it that Quakers do believe and what do we show by our witness and by the fruits of our actions. And these things came to me, these 6 things came to me, and when I started to look for an acronym, I was quite astonished to see that it came to be praise. Now, I think we have a lot to praise God for, not least us and each other, and um, we live in a wonderful world. So I'm very delighted to see that praise is the acronym. So let me talk through each of these then. I've got a little bit more detail for each one of these on the next slide. So, what can Quakers actually offer the world? What do we in practice offer the world? And maybe at the moment we are doing this in a small way, in an inconfident way, because some of these more secular forces have overpowered us. So, for example, in peace building, I think we have a huge role to play in peace building because it is true that we abhor all wars and violence, and we practice non-violent resistance and active peacemaking. Now, I would argue that we do a lot of non-violent resistance and we are amplifying that. And at the moment, that's part of the culture. We are being affected by the culture outside of us to be more and more resistant. And that's where the protest side comes out. But we certainly have huge experience and huge capacity within our church to be actively peacemaking. And I am saddened really that we don't do that more because it is absolutely a root part of who we are and what we do. The second thing in terms of reality is there's something there around, well, we value the knowledge derived from both science and eternal spiritual truth. That is absolutely true. And we do that as part of some very deeply rooted methods. We have a business method that works, which is based on deep corporate communal discernment without hurry. And we have very slow processes normally. And yet, I think we have perhaps shifted our focus and been nudged away, drifted really. I don't know if it's as much as a mutation as a drift. And I think it's a fair criticism that I make anyway, that we are rushing, and I hear other people agreeing with me, that we are sometimes forgetting our deep commitment to letting things happen in God's time. And as I mentioned earlier about our yearly meeting agendas, let's come back to a recognition that actually we are very much in touch with reality. I don't think the Quakers are divorced from reality, even though it might look like it sometimes to our critics. But we do need to remember our deep practices of discernment and give more time for that. Now, anti-consumerism, again, I think is a fairer way of describing what our contribution to the world actually is and can be. And at our best, we absolutely care for the planet, each other, and ourselves in ways that are health-giving and respectful of God's creation. And I think it's fair to say that Quakers generally have this feeling that large industrial scale commercial operations are not helping, whether that's pharmaceutical industry or whatever, and that we are seeking ways that are local rather than these kinds of enormous profit-making enterprises. So anti-consumerism, I think, is again a more explicit way of what actually we show. We show that if you walk through any Quaker church gathering, you will see there's an anti-consumerism in how we are. People bring in vegetables from their allotments and share it, and etc., etc. Now, individualism is going to surprise a lot of Quakers because they're going to say, well, that's a really bad thing, isn't it? That's very selfish, and we really try not to be selfish. And yes, but I don't think that's what individualism might convey, because we are absolutely convinced that each human being is made in the image of God. And like many Christians, I expect, we welcome and cherish each person as unique, precious child of God. And that is deeply rooted in everything that we do, to the extent that if an individual wants a particular, has a particular concern and has a particular direction they want to take, we welcome that generally and allow them to be who they want to be. We give individuals an enormous amount of freedom, really. Now, silent contemplative practice is everything to us, and we have an enormous history and depth of practice here. We have something very special to offer the world. We're rooted in a communal presence practice. Now, these things have been called mindfulness and all sorts of things now, but we have been doing this for hundreds of years. It's grounded in silence and permeated by Christian teaching. And it's a gift that we have that we don't share with others very much. As you will know from the other things on my channel, I we take this into prisons. I'm not the only one. We take this into prisons and we teach people to practice this and to do this, and it works. And if you settle into God's presence in a quiet and listening and prayerful way, you will be uplifted and you will feel the light of Christ within. It just works and it will transform your life for the better. We don't talk about it as much as I wish. And I think that is absolutely something we should talk more about. And then the final one, ethical community. We are organised and nurtured through small communities of practice across the country, a network of small groups working together, and within a larger network across Quakers, across the whole of the UK, working together with divine guidance. But we are a community where individuals, although we value individuals, we're always asking people to work within groups with other people, discerning the way forward, checking your concerns. So ethical community, I think, captures that in a very effective way for thinking about what it is that we offer the world. So I want to just, offer that really as a contribution to these deeply divided times that we live in. And it saddens me that Quakers are being critiqued from outside for having fomented certain types of ideas. And I think that the critique that we have drifted away from Christianity is a deep pain to me. And I think it's because there's some truth in it. And I think we're not really at the moment really capturing what we've lost. So I think that's why Tom Holland's critique really hits home for me. And I think until we realize what we've lost, we're not quite following the cultural developments that are happening, political, social, technological, in the world. And I think this is hopefully one contribution to think about, well, what is our offering? How can we provide guidance? Because I do think we have some new ways of thinking about, fresh ways of thinking about these issues because we're deeply grounded in our practice. So I hope this is part of the conversation. And I think it's a worrying time in a sense because the violence that we're seeing erupt is showing up that there are certain ideological positions which have a lack of clarity around what violence is and the difference between the bullet and a verbal discussion that might hurt somebody's feelings. And we're losing clarity on that, um, which is heartbreaking and quite frankly dangerous. And if we don't see it for ourselves, we will be criticized from outside. And there's a great danger then in a polarizing tendency that is we're going to be part of the problem, even more so. So I do hope that we begin to see ourselves as part of the solution here to thinking about how we unify and help to build bridges, and to carry on talking. So I think, when conversations stop, violence begins. And I think that's so important to remember. So I hope you will take on board that as a positive contribution to today's world.